Hi, my name is Andrea Atkinson. I work for the National Park Service, South Florida Natural Resources Center. I'm also on the Recovery Executive Committee, and I'm here to discuss the Recover update to the conceptual ecological models and hypothesis clusters. So why is Recover updating the conceptual ecological models and hypothesis clusters? Well, the first models were published in December 2005 edition of the Wetlands Journal, and a lot has been learned over the past 10 to 15 years since then. New problems and issues have emerged, our restoration actions are much better defined, and we need to update our monitoring and assessment plan and determine priorities for funding research and monitoring going into the future. And we need to basically pull together our understanding of the system once again into one document so it's findable by everybody. So what is a conceptual ecological model? Well, John Ogden in 2005 defined it as non-quantitative planning tools used to identify the major ecological and anthropogenic drivers and stressors on natural systems, the ecological effects of these stressors, and the biological attributes or indicators of these ecological responses. But a shorter way of thinking about it is what is causing this system to change? A conceptual ecological model consists of both a narrative, which can be anywhere from 20 to 60 or even more pages, and a diagram, which kind of provides an overview of what is discussed in the narrative. The framework being used by Recover involves a drivers, stressors, effects, attributes framework. Drivers are the big picture forces that are the underlying causes of the change in the Everglades system, whereas stressors are the more near-term physical, chemical, biological mechanisms that are causing the change in the system. And these are in turn affected by the drivers. Ecological effects are what are triggered by the stressors on the system, and they can be dynamic processes. These can be positive, these can be negative, they can be neutral, and in turn attributes are a parsimonious subset of ecosystem components that are thought to be representative of the overall ecological conditions of the system. So here's an example from our updated ridge and slough conceptual ecological model diagram. So our drivers, for example, are sea level rise, climate patterns and change, water management, and land use and land management. And within each of these boxes, we've tried to add, the various subcomponents that tend to be a focus, whether it's compartmentalization, droughts, floods, adjacent land use, and so on. Stressors is the next line down in our diagrams. In this case, it's salinity, our greatly altered spatial extent and distribution of the ridge and slough system, the altered hydrology of the system, altered fire patterns, nutrient enrichment and contaminants, and an introduction and spread of our exotic flora and fauna. These in turn have effects on the system that range from effects on the microtopography and the soils, to the spread of cattails, to the fish and invertebrate community composition and structure. And our attributes, our key attributes for the ridge and slough system were identified as the mosaic of marsh, slough, and tree island plant communities, the tree islands themselves, periphyton, alligators, wetland mammals, wading birds, marsh fishes, invertebrates, and herpetofauna, and the Everglades snail kite. The total system model is a big picture look at the overall system and has been redesigned a little to try and show the linkages to each of the regional conceptual ecological models and list each of the key attributes of those regional conceptual ecological models down below. So you're probably well familiar with the Recover regions. We have Lake Okeechobee, the northern estuaries of the St. Lucie Estuary and the Caloosahatchee Estuary, the Greater Everglades region, the southern coastal systems that goes all the way from Biscayne Bay, Florida Bay to the southwest coast. And we have the new region that's being added in for Big Cypress. So our conceptual ecological models involve one for the total system. Lake Okeechobee has one, Northern Estuaries has one, Greater Everglades has two, Original Slough and Southern Marl Prairies. Southern Coastal Systems has three for Biscayne Bay, Florida Bay, and the Southwest Coast. And then Big Cypress is its own conceptual ecological model. So next, what is a hypothesis cluster? These were originally added into the 2009 Recover Monitoring and Assessment Plan, i.e. called the MAP. They are a subset of the conceptual ecological model with much more details, especially with regards to how restoration is anticipated to affect the ecosystem components and its relationships. It basically allows us to drill in and add more detail. It doesn't necessarily follow the driver, stressor, effect, attribute framework. Basically, we've told our folks whatever most effectively tells the story of that hypothesis cluster. This is an example of the 2009 Greater Everglades Trophic Hypothesis Cluster, and it's basically relating our system and effects on prey to our wading bird responses in the system. So this is a list of our hypothesis clusters under development. Northern estuaries, we've got oysters and submerged aquatic vegetation, fisheries. Our Big Cypress hypothesis clusters that we know are going to be developed are the fire and hydrology and traditional use plants, and there'll probably be several others that will be coming on board with Big Cypress. An additional purpose of our conceptual ecological models is to help us identify critical uncertainties that might constrain our decision making and or put our restoration success at risk, such as critical information needed for our modeling or planning, verifying some of our critical assumptions, optimizing the balance between competing objectives or constraints, or identifying new or unclear issues that may slow or prevent us from achieving our goals. So how does development of conceptual ecological models and hypothesis clusters help SERP? Well, by developing these conceptual ecological models and drilling into developing hypothesis clusters on the more detailed needs of SERP, this then feeds in turn into development of ecological computer models. It helps us develop our performance measures for our projects. It helps us identify our critical uncertainties that we need to resolve as soon as possible. And these in turn help us with our project planning, and they help us with developing our system-wide monitoring and assessment plan, and also our project monitoring and adaptive management plans. Some of the biggest changes involve a greater emphasis on sea level rise and climate change, including hypothesis clusters in the Big Cypress region, such as for flood and fire and traditional use plants, trying to create a better linkage to the restoration actions that are being planned, and identifying, for uncertainties, which uncertainties have been confirmed, such as between alligators and wading birds, or between juvenile crocodiles and salinids, which uncertainties have had more details fleshed out, such as the relationship between oyster impacts and the frequency and duration of high inflow events, or the specifics of the water recession rates needed for wading bird foraging. And in some cases, new uncertainties identified, such as between nutrient spikes we're seeing at the end of dry season flows and new invasive species, such as, of course, the pythons. So the current status of this report update is that all the diagrams for the conceptual ecological models have been drafted and updated for all the regions. Northern estuaries and Lake Okeechobee decided to work on their hypothesis clusters first. Northern estuaries, their fish hypothesis cluster has had its initial review, and they are working on their conceptual ecological model narrative. Their oyster hypothesis cluster is partially drafted. Like Okeechobee, their hypothesis clusters have been sent out for review, and they are working on their conceptual ecological model narrative. Greater Everglades took the reverse approach and is working on its conceptual ecological models first, and the Ridge and Slough model is nearly ready for review, and they'll be working on the narrative for the Southern Marl Prairies next, followed by the hypothesis clusters. Southern Coastal Systems has been working at both at the same time. Their narratives for the conceptual ecological models are near completion, and the hypothesis clusters are in various stages of progress. They are planning on sharing the oyster and fish hypothesis clusters with northern estuaries. The Big Cypress has held initial meetings, and the CEM diagram has been updated, but much of the rest of the work remains. A big thank you to everyone involved. This has been a big effort across multiple agencies and tribes and partners. And so a big thank you to everyone who's involved. There's too many for me to shout them out all at once. So with that, thank you very much.